The summer sun at 9,000 feet burned different than it did down in the valleys. Samuel Blackwood felt it the moment he stepped out of his tent that July morning in 1876, a kind of heat that came straight down without mercy, the thin air offering no cushion against it. By noon, the inside of a canvas shelter could reach 95 degrees. By 2 in the afternoon, 105. Men working claims in the gulches below Leadville learned to rest during the midday hours or risk heat stroke. But summer heat was only half the problem. Come January, those same mountain valleys turned into ice boxes. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero on clear nights, sometimes 40 below when Arctic air settled into the high parks. The wind that funneled through the mountain passes could strip warmth from a cabin faster than any stove could replace it. Men burned 4 cords of wood a month just to keep a single room above freezing. Some didn't make it through their first winter. The standard cabin design had been developed in the forests of Pennsylvania and Virginia, then carried west by settlers who built what they knew. A man would fell 20 or 30 logs, notch them at the corners, stack them up to make walls 7 feet high. The logs were typically 8 to 12 inches in diameter, big enough to provide some insulation, small enough that one man could lift them into place. The gaps between logs got chinked with mud, mixed with grass or moss, and that was that. A cabin could go up in 2 weeks if a man worked steady, 3 weeks if he took his time or had to work alone. The design made sense for Pennsylvania, where winters were cold but not murderous, where timber was plentiful, where a man could cut firewood without worrying about thin air, making every swing of the axe feel like the last. It made sense for country where summer meant warm, not scorching. In the Colorado high country, it made considerably less sense. The cabins went up fast, though, and that counted for something. Time was money when you had a claim to work. Every day spent building was a day not spent digging silver out of the mountain. So men built quick, built standard, and figured they'd manage the rest. By the winter of 1875 to 76, the growing settlement that would become Leadville had maybe 200 cabins scattered through the valley and up into the gulches. They all looked about the same. 10 feet by 12 feet was common. 12 by 14 if a man had a family or grand ambitions. Single-wall log construction, flat roof or low-pitched roof. One window if you were lucky, none if you weren't. A door that never quite fit the frame. Gaps between logs that leaked air, no matter how much chinking you stuffed in them. When the cold came, it came hard. Men woke to find frost coating the inside walls of their cabins, their breath freezing in the air above their beds. They kept their stoves burning through the night, feeding them every few hours, and still the cold crept in. Water buckets froze solid, food froze, ink froze in bottles. The cabins couldn't hold heat against the relentless draw of 30 below air outside. Wood consumption became a desperate matter. A standard cabin burned 3 to 4 cords of wood per month in deep winter. That meant a man had to have 15 to 20 cords laid up before the first snow. And that meant 6 to 8 weeks of nothing but cutting, splitting, and stacking. Time not spent working your claim. Money not earned. Some men tried burning coal from the surface outcroppings, but coal stoves were expensive, and the cabin still leaked heat like a sieve. A hot stove in a poorly insulated cabin just meant you were hot near the stove and frozen everywhere else. Summer brought different misery. The thin mountain air provided little buffer against solar radiation. By late morning, a dark log cabin became an oven. The logs themselves absorbed heat throughout the day, then radiated it inward all night. Men slept outside when they could, but afternoon thunderstorms made that a gamble. Inside, the still air became suffocating. There was no good answer. Open the door and window for ventilation, and you let in mosquitoes and flies. Keep them closed, and you baked. The conventional wisdom said this was simply the price of living at altitude. Old-timers claimed you got used to it. You learned to sleep cold in winter and hot in summer. You learned to live with a stove that never quite kept up with the cold, or that made your cabin unbearable when you needed to cook. The economic pressure to conform to standard building practices was considerable. Materials cost money. Time cost money. A man who spent 3 months building an elaborate cabin was a man who lost 3 months of mining income. The difference between a 2-week build and a 3-month build could mean the difference between making your steak and going broke before spring. So everyone built the same way. Quick, simple, insufficient. Samuel Blackwood was 43 years old in the summer of 1876 when he filed his claim in California Gulch and started planning his cabin. He'd been born in 1833 in Vermont, son of a furniture maker who taught him to work wood with precision and to think about how materials behaved. At 18, Samuel had headed west to the Wisconsin timber camps, where he'd spent 7 years falling trees and running saw operations. In 1858, he'd gone further west to the newly opened Kansas Territory, where he'd tried farming for 3 years before drought and grasshoppers convinced him that agriculture wasn't his calling. What he'd learned, though, was how to read the land and how settlers from different places approached the same problems differently. The Germans built different than the Norwegians. The Swedes built different than the Yankees. And the few Indians who talked to white settlers built different than any of them. The Civil War had pulled him in for 2 years, enlisted in the Wisconsin Regiment, served as a quartermaster sergeant, which meant he'd spent 2 years watching how armies kept men alive in temporary structures through brutal winters and sweltering summers. He'd seen men die from heat exhaustion in Virginia. He'd seen men lose fingers and toes to frostbite in Tennessee. He'd learned that the difference between adequate shelter and inadequate shelter could be measured in lives. After the war, Samuel had drifted to Minnesota, where he'd worked as a carpenter and builder for 9 years. This was where his real education had begun. Minnesota winters made Pennsylvania winters look gentle. 40 below zero was common. 50 below happened. And the immigrant communities, Norwegian, Swedish, German, had brought building techniques from places where cold was a fact of life, not an occasional visitor. The Norwegians knew about thermal mass and insulation. The Swedes understood air movement and vapor barriers. The Germans had ideas about earth sheltering and using the ground's stable temperature to moderate interior conditions. Samuel had worked on enough houses to see these principles in action. He'd seen which houses stayed warm on less fuel. He'd seen which houses stayed comfortable in summer without becoming ovens. He'd also spent 2 winters living with the Chippewa Band, trading carpentry work for food and shelter while he recovered from a logging injury. They'd taught him things about building for cold that white men mostly dismissed. How to think about wind. How to position a structure to use the sun. How to create thermal barriers without wasting materials. When silver discoveries in the Colorado high country drew men by the thousands in 1875 and 1876, Samuel had come too, but he came with 25 years of experience that most prospectors didn't have. He came knowing that the standard cabin design would make life miserable. He came prepared to build different. The problem was that building different made you look foolish. Samuel filed his claim on June 12, 1876, and started laying out his cabin site a week later. From the beginning, his neighbors noticed that something was off. He'd chosen a spot on the south-facing slope of the gulch, which made sense. But then he'd started digging. Most men leveled a spot, maybe dug down 6 inches to get to solid ground for a foundation. Samuel dug a pit 3 feet deep and 16 feet square. Tom Granger, who had the claim just downslope, stopped by on the 3rd day of digging. He was a Pennsylvania man, 26 years old, building his cabin the way he'd learned back home. "You putting in a basement?" Tom asked, watching Samuel throw another shovel of dirt onto the growing pile. "Something like that," Samuel said. "Lot of work for a basement. Most men just build on top of the ground. Most men freeze or roast too. Tom laughed. You planning to live underground like a badger? Just thinking about temperature, Samuel said. 3 feet down, the ground stays about 45 degrees year-round. Warmer than the air in winter. Cooler than the air in summer. Tom shook his head. You'll have water problems. Spring melt will fill that hole like a pond. Not if I drain it proper, Samuel said. And not if I build up above it with a proper foundation. Word spread that the new man was building strange. Other miners stopped by to watch and comment. Most of the comments weren't encouraging. You building a mine or a house? Asked Peter Davidson, a Scots immigrant who'd been in the Gulch since 1874. House, Samuel said. Could have fooled me. That's a hell of a hole. Samuel kept digging. He had no intention of actually living underground. That would solve the temperature problem, but create a dozen others involving moisture and ventilation and plain human spirit. But he did intend to use that stable ground temperature as a foundation for the rest of his approach. When he dug out his pit, he laid in drainage tile at the bottom, sloping it to carry away any water that seeped in. Then he filled the pit with Rocks River cobbles he hauled up from the creek below, along with any good-sized stones he could find. The rock fill would prevent frost heave, would provide drainage, and would serve as thermal mass to moderate temperature swings. Then he built his foundation wall up from the bottom of the pit to 3 feet above ground level. He used dry stacked stone from a nearby outcropping, massive blocks that required a crowbar and wooden levers to move into position. The foundation wall ended up being 18 inches thick. Tom Granger, who'd finished his own cabin by this point 10 by 12 feet, single-wall logs, built in 16 days, stopped by to shake his head at Samuel's progress. You've been at this 3 weeks, and you haven't even started on walls yet, Tom said. I've been sleeping in my cabin for 4 days already. How's it sleeping? Samuel asked. Cold at night, warm during the day, but it's shelter. That's the point. Shelter's good, Samuel agreed. Comfortable shelter's better. Comfortable costs time. Time costs money. So does firewood. And so does being miserable. Tom shrugged. Your claim, your choice. But winter comes early up here. You might want to consider speed over perfection. Samuel appreciated the advice, even if he had no intention of following it. Tom was a decent man offering practical counsel based on what he knew. The problem was that what Tom knew was inadequate for this climate. By mid-July, when Samuel finally started laying up his wall logs, he'd spent 5 weeks on foundation work alone. Other cabins in the Gulch had been built start to finish in less time. The mockery was gentle but persistent. That's going to be some cabin, men said. If you finish before snow. Might be the best cabin in the territory. Might also be the last cabin you finish before your money runs out. Samuel understood their perspective. Every day he spent building was a day he couldn't work his claim. He was burning through his savings. But he also knew that a cabin built right would save him money and misery over years, while a cabin built quick would cost him every single day he lived in it. He'd made his choice. He'd accept the mockery. He'd accept the risk. He'd seen enough cold and enough heat to know that adequate shelter wasn't adequate at all. The foundation work had taken 5 weeks, but it established the principle that would guide everything else Samuel did. Thermal mass and insulation working together. The rock-filled pit and massive foundation wall would moderate temperature swings. What he built on top would determine whether that advantage was amplified or wasted. For his wall logs, Samuel chose carefully. He wanted straight-grained spruce about 14 inches in diameter larger than most cabin logs, which meant more insulation value in the wood itself, but also meant each log was significantly harder to move in place. He spent a week falling trees, another week limbing them, and hauling them to the cabin site using a borrowed mule. Where the standard approach was to stack logs directly on top of each other, with just chinking in the gaps, Samuel had something different in mind. He'd seen double wall construction in Minnesota too, walls with a gap between them, the gap filled with insulating material. The principle was sound. Still air was an excellent insulator, and if you could trap air between barriers, you could prevent heat loss in winter and heat gain in summer. But double wall construction in Minnesota usually meant plank walls, expensive and hard to come by in a mining camp where the nearest sawmill was 20 miles away and running full-time just to provide lumber for sluice boxes and mine timbers. Samuel's solution was to combine log construction with the double wall principle. He built his first wall using logs notched and stacked in the traditional manner, but he held it to a total wall height of only 6.5 feet shorter than standard, and he kept the wall a full 14 inches thick by using his larger logs. This inner wall went up on top of his foundation, creating a structure 16 feet by 20 feet inside. Larger than most cabins, but Samuel figured if he was going to spend the effort, he might as well have the space. Then came the unusual part. 3 feet outside his inner wall, he built a second wall. This outer wall used smaller logs, 8 to 10 inches in diameter. He notched them the same way, stacked them the same way, but he only took this wall up 5 feet high. The result was a gap between his inner and outer wall that was 3 feet wide at the bottom, narrowing as both walls went up. Peter Davidson stopped by the day Samuel started on his outer wall. "What in the hell are you doing?" Peter asked. "Building a wall," Samuel said. "You already have a wall. That's a fine wall right there. That's the inner wall. This is the outer wall. You building 2 houses, one inside the other? One house with 2 walls." Peter stared at the construction, trying to work out the logic. "That gap between them, what's that for?" "Insulation," Samuel said. "The gap will be filled with dried grass and moss. 1.5 feet of trapped material between the walls. Heat won't get through that easy in summer. Won't get out easy in winter. That's..." Peter paused, calculating. "That's a hell of a lot of extra work, and extra logs." "It is," Samuel agreed. "And you still need a roof, and chinking, and a door, and windows." "I do. Samuel, it's late July. You've been at this 9 weeks. Most men would have been working their claim for 7 weeks by now. Most men will burn 4 cords of wood a month come winter," Samuel said. "I'm planning on burning less than 2. That's 2 cords a month I don't have to cut. 2 cords a month is near about a week's work every month. Over a 6-month winter, that's 6 weeks of work saved. Plus, I'll be comfortable instead of miserable." Peter shook his head. "If you finish before snow." "That's a big if." "I'll finish," Samuel said. "Might be close, but I'll finish." The double wall construction took another 3 weeks. The outer wall went up faster than the inner wall had, being both lower and made of smaller logs, but filling the gap between the walls with insulating material was tedious work. Samuel spent several days cutting marsh grass from a boggy area down near the creek, spreading it out to dry, and packing it into the space between walls. He layered and dried moss he collected from the shady sides of rocks and trees. He packed it all down firmly, but not so tight that it compressed too much. Compressed insulation was less effective than lofted insulation, a lesson he'd learned in Minnesota. The roof presented its own challenges. The standard flat or low-pitched roof made sense for quick construction, but it also meant that snow accumulated on the roof in winter, adding weight and providing an avenue for heat loss. A steeper roof would shed snow better, but it required more framing. Samuel compromised. He built a pitched roof at a 6/12 slope steep enough to shed snow, shallow enough that he could frame it without extraordinary effort. But he didn't just throw poles across the top and lay on shakes or sod. Instead, he built a roof system with the same double-layer principle as his walls. The inner roof was made of small diameter poles laid close together, then covered with a layer of split shakes. On top of the shakes, He laid a thick mat of pine boughs and a foot of dried grass and moss. Over that insulation layer, he built an outer roof frame, covered it with more shakes, and topped the entire structure with overlapping sheets of bark from large spruce trees, sealed with pine pitch. Tom Granger, whose own cabin had a simple pole and sod roof that he'd thrown together in an afternoon, watched Samuel work on his roof for the better part of a week. "That roof is going to weigh about 100 pounds more than it needs to," Tom observed. "It's also going to keep me warm in winter and cool in summer," Samuel said. "Tom's right, though," added James Wheeler, who'd built his cabin in the same gulch. "That's an awful lot of weight, and an awful lot of effort for a roof that'll probably work about the same as mine." "We'll see come winter," Samuel said. "Your whole cabin is different," James said. "Double walls, thick roof, that massive foundation. You spent more on this cabin than most men spend on a house down in Denver." "Haven't spent much money," Samuel said. "Mostly spent time and effort." "Time is money," James said. "You could have built a regular cabin in 3 weeks and spent the last 8 weeks working your claim. The silver you could have dug would have paid for a hell of a lot of firewood." This was the economic argument Samuel had been hearing for months, and it was hard to refute directly. Building conventional was faster and let you get to profitable work sooner. The problem was that the calculation ignored the ongoing costs of living in an uncomfortable, inefficient cabin. It ignored the physical toll of being cold all winter. It ignored the value of comfort and health. "Maybe so," Samuel said. "But I'm building for 10 years, not 10 weeks. This cabin will save me time and effort every single winter I live in it." "If silver holds," James said, "this boom might be done in 2 years. If silver's done in 2 years, I'll sell the cabin to someone else. Either way, it'll be worth what I put into it." The windows were another point of difference. Most cabins had one small window, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, covered with oiled paper or cloth in winter. Glass was expensive and hard to transport. But small windows meant dark interiors, and dark interiors meant living in gloom for 6 months of the year. Samuel had ordered 2 glass windows from Denver Real Glass, 2 feet by 3 feet each, double-paned with a 1/4-inch air gap between the panes. They'd cost him $18, which was more than some men spent on their entire cabin. The windows arrived in late August, packed in straw, miraculously unbroken after the wagon trip from Denver. He installed them on the south wall, where winter sun would stream through. Between the windows, he built a small alcove with a stone shelf, a sun-warmed spot that would be pleasant to sit in winter, a heat sink that would absorb solar warmth during the day and radiate it at night. The door was another carefully considered element. A standard cabin door was just planks fastened together, hung on leather hinges, with gaps around the edges that you stuffed with rags in winter. Samuel built a proper door frame, then constructed a door that was 2 inches thick, 2 layers of planks with tar paper between them. He hung it on iron hinges he bought in Leadville for 75 cents. The door fit its frame snugly enough that a piece of paper couldn't pass through the gaps when it was closed. Around the door frame, both inside and out, he installed weather stripping made from strips of old wool blanket. The door, when closed and latched, sealed completely. "That's a bank vault door," Tom said when he saw it. "Expecting someone to rob you?" "Expecting wind," Samuel said, "and expecting to keep heat in. Must be 100 pounds of door there. 90 probably. But it opens easy on those hinges, and it doesn't let any air through." By early September, with first frost already hitting the high country, Samuel was working on finishing details. He chinked every gap in both his inner and outer walls using a mixture of clay, sand, lime, and chopped grass, a formula he'd learned in Minnesota that was more durable than plain mud chinking. He worked methodically, filling every crack and gap, knowing that air infiltration could undermine all his other efforts. Inside, he built a stone thermal mass wall behind, where his stove would sit. This wall was 18 inches thick, made of flat rocks dry stacked and extending from floor to ceiling. The idea was that the stove would heat the stone, and the stone would continue radiating heat long after the fire died down. It was a principle he'd seen used in European buildings, and it made particular sense in a climate where nighttime temperatures could be 30 degrees colder than daytime temperatures. The stove itself was a cast iron model from a maker in St. Louis, shipped to Denver, then freighted to Leadville, and hauled up to Samuel's claim on a rented wagon. It cost $24 expensive, but it had features that cheaper stoves lacked. It had an air intake that could be precisely controlled, meaning you could burn a small fire efficiently rather than having to stoke it constantly. It had a large firebox that could hold enough wood to burn for 6 hours, and it had a flat top with good heat distribution for cooking. Samuel installed the stove with its back directly against his thermal mass wall, with only 2 inches of air gap to prevent direct contact. The stovepipe went up and out through a triple wall thimble that prevented any heat loss where the pipe penetrated the roof. One more innovation went into the cabin that September: a ventilation system. Samuel understood that a tightly sealed cabin could develop problems with humidity and stale air, especially in winter, when the cabin would be closed up tight. He'd seen this in Minnesota houses that were built well, but ventilated poorly. Moisture from cooking and breathing would condense on cold surfaces, leading to mold and rot. His solution was to install 2 ventilation pipes. One was an intake near the floor on the north wall, a 4-inch pipe that could be opened or closed with a wooden plug. The other was an exhaust vent at the highest point of the ceiling, another 4-inch pipe that extended up through the roof, capped with a simple hood to keep out rain and snow. The principle was that warm air would rise and exit through the ceiling vent, while fresh air would be drawn in through the floor vent. By adjusting the vents, Samuel could control the rate of air exchange. In deep winter, he could close them almost completely. In mild weather, he could open them for full ventilation. "You've got more holes in this cabin than most cabins have logs," Peter said when he saw the vent system. "I thought the whole point was keeping air out." "The point is controlling air," Samuel said. "I want to keep wind out, but I want to be able to bring fresh air in when I need it, and let stale air out. Seems complicated. Seems necessary," Samuel said. By late September, the cabin was essentially complete. Samuel had been building for 15 weeks, nearly 4 months. A standard cabin took 2 to 3 weeks. He'd used more than twice as many logs, had quarried and placed several tons of stone, had filled 20 cubic yards of space with insulation, had built a roof system that weighed half a ton. The cost in materials had been substantial. The glass windows, $18. The door hardware, 75 cents. The stove, $24. Lime for chinking, $2. Iron work for various brackets and supports, $3. The stovepipe and thimble, $4. Total material cost, about $52, not counting logs and stone that he'd harvested himself. But the real cost was time. 15 weeks of labor that could have been spent working his claim. At an optimistic assessment of what he might have earned mining, that was perhaps $300 in lost income. The total investment in the cabin was therefore around $350 in materials and opportunity cost. A standard cabin, by comparison, cost perhaps $5 in materials, door hinges, a bit of hardware, maybe some nails, and 3 weeks of time, perhaps $30 total. Samuel's cabin had cost him more than 10 times what a standard cabin cost. He moved in on October 1st, 1876, as the aspen trees turned gold on the mountainsides, and evening temperatures began dropping below freezing. He was broke, having spent his savings and having earned nothing from his claim all summer. He had barely enough supplies to last through October, and he'd need to work the claim hard for the next month to have any hope of making enough money to buy provisions for winter. But he had his cabin, and he was about to find out whether his 4 months of work had been wisdom or folly. October was mild. Temperatures dropped into the 20s at night, climbed into the 50s during the day. Samuel worked his claim from dawn until the light failed, making up for lost time. The cabin performed well in these moderate conditions, staying comfortable with just a small fire morning and evening. But October wasn't the test. October was practice. November brought the first real cold. On November 8th, the temperature dropped to 5 above zero overnight. Snow fell for 2 days straight, leaving 8 inches on the ground. The men in the gulch fired up their stoves and settled in for the long haul. In Tom Granger's cabin, the stove burned hot from evening until morning. Tom woke every 3 hours to feed it, and still he could see his breath in the cabin. Frost formed on the inside of his walls. The single small window, covered with oiled canvas, let in almost no light. He burned through a quarter cord of wood in 3 days. In Samuel's cabin, things were different. Samuel lit his stove in the evening and let it burn for 2 hours with a moderate fire. The cast iron radiated heat efficiently. The stone wall behind the stove absorbed heat and began radiating it back into the room. By the time Samuel banked the fire and went to bed around 9 o'clock, the cabin was comfortably warm, not hot, but a pleasant 65 degrees. When he woke at dawn, the temperature had dropped to 58 degrees. The fire had been out for 8 hours, and the outside temperature was 0, but the cabin had only lost 7 degrees. The insulation in the walls and roof was doing exactly what Samuel had designed it to do, slowing the transfer of heat. He lit the stove again, a small fire this time, and within an hour, the cabin was back to 65 degrees. He'd burned perhaps a quarter of the wood that Tom had burned next door. But November wasn't the real test either. The real test came in January. The winter of 1876 to 77 was brutal across the Colorado high country. December had been cold, but not exceptional. January, though, turned vicious. A massive Arctic outbreak settled over the Rockies on January 12th and didn't break for 18 days. On the night of January 15th, the temperature in California Gulch dropped to 38 below zero. By morning, it had dropped further 42 below in the still air before dawn. The sun, when it rose, provided light but little warmth. The daytime high that day was 0 degrees. That night, the temperature dropped again, 44 below. For 8 consecutive nights, the temperature fell below 40 below zero. For 12 consecutive days, it never climbed above 5 above. The cold was relentless, murderous, the kind of cold that killed careless men and made even careful men suffer. In the standard cabins scattered through the gulch and across the valley, men fought to survive. They kept their stoves burning day and night, feeding them constantly. Tom Granger burned through a full cord of wood in 8 days. He wore every piece of clothing he owned to bed. He woke with frost on his blankets where his breath had frozen. The single-wall log construction simply couldn't hold heat against 44 below temperatures outside. Peter Davidson, whose cabin was a little better built than most, had his water bucket freeze solid despite keeping it next to the stove. His sourdough starter froze and died. His ink froze. His boots froze, and he had to warm them by the fire in the morning before he could get them on his feet. James Wheeler ran out of firewood on the 6th day of the cold snap. He'd thought he had enough wood cut, but he hadn't counted on burning at the rate he was burning. He hiked down to Tom's cabin at midday, desperate, and Tom helped him haul up a few days' worth of wood from Tom's supply. James paid him back later, but the experience shook him. Running out of firewood in 40 below cold was a death sentence. In town, 3 men died during those 18 days. One was found frozen in his cabin. His fire had gone out in the night, and he hadn't woken to restart it, or perhaps had been too weak to restart it. Another was found on the trail between his cabin and the settlement. He'd tried to walk to town for supplies in 35 below cold and hadn't made it. The third was an older man whose heart gave out while he was struggling to split frozen wood. In Samuel's cabin, life went on with almost routine normalcy. The first night of 42 below cold, Samuel lit his stove at 6 in the evening and kept a moderate fire burning until 10 o'clock. The cabin heated to a comfortable 68 degrees. He banked the fire, closed the stove's air intake to a bare crack, and went to bed. He woke once in the night to add wood more from habit than necessity. When he rose at dawn, the cabin temperature was 61 degrees. Outside, it was 44 below. The cabin had lost only 7 degrees over 8 hours with no fire. He restarted the fire and let it burn for an hour while he made coffee and breakfast. By the time he sat down to eat, the cabin was back to 68 degrees. He let the fire die down after breakfast. The thick walls, the insulated roof, the thermal mass in the foundation, and in the stone wall, behind the stove, all of it was working together to hold heat. During the day, with the sun shining through his south-facing windows, the cabin actually gained heat, even though the outside temperature never climbed above zero. The stone shelf between the windows grew warm to the touch. The stone thermal mass wall absorbed solar heat. By mid-afternoon, the cabin was 70 degrees without the stove burning at all. In the evening, as the sun set and the temperature plummeted again, Samuel lit the stove for another 2-hour burn. The cycle repeated. 2 hours of fire in the morning, 2 hours in the evening, and the cabin stayed comfortable through the worst cold that Colorado could throw at it. He was burning less than half a cord of wood per week, about 2 cords per month. Tom next door was burning more than 4 times that. On the 5th day of the cold snap, Tom came to Samuel's cabin around midday. He knocked on the door, and Samuel opened it. A wave of warm air rolled out, and Tom's eyes widened. "How is it warm in here?" Tom asked. "I saw your stovepipe. You're not running that stove any harder than I'm running mine. Less hard, even." "Come in," Samuel said. "Get warm." Tom stepped inside and closed the door. The difference from his own cabin was immediately obvious. There was no frost on the walls. The air felt comfortable, not cold. The temperature was probably 65 degrees warmer than Tom's cabin had been, with a roaring fire going. "This is ... double quotes." Tom struggled for words. "This is remarkable. How are you doing this?" "The insulation," Samuel said. "The double walls with grass and moss between them. The thick roof. The tight door. The heat doesn't get out, so I don't have to keep putting it in." Tom walked around the interior of the cabin, looking at the construction details he'd watched Samuel build, but hadn't really understood. He looked at the massive foundation, the thick walls, the thermal mass behind the stove. "I called you a fool when you were digging that foundation," Tom said. "I thought you were wasting time." "I remember," Samuel said. "I was wrong," Tom said. "I've been feeding my stove every 2 hours for 5 days. I'm burning wood faster than I can cut it. I'm cold all the time. And you're in here comfortable, burning a fraction of what I'm burning." "The principles aren't complicated," Samuel said. "Insulation to slow heat loss. Thermal mass to store heat. Tight construction to prevent air infiltration. It's work up front, but it pays back every single day you live in the cabin." "I can't afford to rebuild my cabin," Tom said. "I'm already broke from buying firewood from men who cut extra. But if I'd known, if I'd understood what you were doing, ... double quotes, you can improve what you've got," Samuel said. "Pack the gaps in your walls better. Build an insulated door. Add a layer to your roof. You won't get to this," he gestured at his cabin, "but you can get better than what you've got." Tom nodded slowly. "I'm going to do that. When this cold breaks and I can work outside without dying, I'm going to do that." Word spread quickly. Tom wasn't the only one who noticed that Samuel's stovepipe barely showed smoke while everyone else's poured constant streams. Men started stopping by to see the cabin, to ask questions, to understand what Samuel had done. Peter Davidson came by on the 7th day of the cold snap. "I need to see this," he said. Samuel showed him around, explained the double wall construction, the insulation, the thermal mass, the ventilation system, all of it. Peter listened intently, occasionally asking questions. "This is engineering," Peter said when Samuel finished. "This isn't just building a cabin. This is engineering a thermal system. It's thinking about how heat moves," Samuel said, "and how to control it. How much did this cost you?" "Materials, about $50. Time, about 15 weeks. Peter shook his head. "I spent 3 weeks and $5 on my cabin. And I'm burning myself into poverty trying to keep it warm. If I make it through this winter, I'm building different next year. I'm building like this." The cold snap broke on January 29th. The temperature climbed to 20 above zero, and men emerged from their cabins like bears from hibernation. Wood piles that had looked adequate in December were now half gone or worse. Men who'd planned on 6 cords of wood lasting all winter had already burned through 4 cords, and it was only late January. The mathematics of survival had changed. A standard cabin at 9,000 feet in a winter like this one needed 5 to 6 cords of wood to make it through. Cutting 5 cords of wood was 6 to 8 weeks of hard labor. That was 6 to 8 weeks not working your claim, not earning money, not getting ahead. Samuel's cabin, by contrast, would make it through winter on 2.5 cords. That was 2 weeks of wood cutting instead of 8. That was 6 weeks of saved time that could go to mining or to anything else. The economic argument that had seemed to favor standard quick construction now looked different. Yes, Samuel had spent an extra 12 weeks building, but he'd save 6 weeks every winter. After 2 winters, he'd be ahead on time, and he'd be comfortable while he did it. Men started asking detailed questions. How thick should the insulation be? What's the best material? How do you build the double wall? How do you keep moisture out? What about ventilation? What about the foundation? Samuel answered every question patiently. He explained the principles, not just the techniques. He wanted people to understand why things worked, not just how to copy what he'd done. Different situations would call for different solutions, but the principles would remain the same. In late February, Tom Granger started rebuilding his cabin. He couldn't afford to tear it down and start over, but he could improve it. He built a second wall on the outside of his existing cabin, leaving a 2-foot gap that he filled with dried grass and pine boughs. He rebuilt his roof with a layer of insulation between the inner and outer layers. He built a proper door. The improvements cost him 3 weeks of work and about $10 in materials, but the difference was immediate. His firewood consumption dropped by more than half. His cabin stopped being a battle against the cold and became something approaching comfortable. Peter Davidson watched Tom's improvements and decided to go further. In the spring of 1877, he tore down his cabin completely and rebuilt using Samuel's principles. Double walls with insulation, pitched roof with thermal barrier, thermal mass walls, tight construction throughout. Peter's second cabin took him 2 months to build, working evenings and weekends while he mined during the days. But when he moved in that October, he moved into a cabin that would serve him well for years. That winter, he burned less than 2 cords of wood per month, and he wrote letters to friends back in Scotland describing the building technique. James Wheeler took a different approach. He didn't rebuild, but when he filed a second claim up in another gulch in the spring of 1877 and needed to build a cabin there, he built it Samuel's way. Double walls, insulation, thermal mass. He even improved on Samuel's design in a few ways, adding a root cellar dug into the hillside and covered with stone, a space that stayed just above freezing year-round, perfect for storing vegetables and meat. By the winter of 1877 to 78, there were 8 cabins in California Gulch built on Samuel's principles. By 1878 to 79, there were more than 20. The technique spread to other mining camps in the area. Men who'd spent a winter in standard cabins and men seen or heard about. Samuel's approach built different when they built their next cabin. The modifications varied. Some men couldn't afford glass windows and used oiled paper instead, but they built double-pane frames to trap air. Some men used sawdust for insulation instead of grass and moss. It was easier to get in quantity, and it worked nearly as well. Some men built with stone for their outer wall instead of logs, using whatever material was most readily available. But the core principles remained: thermal mass, insulation, tight construction, controlled ventilation. Build a cabin that holds heat in winter and keeps heat out in summer. Accept the initial cost in time and materials because the ongoing benefits would repay it many times over. The change in building practices happened slowly but steadily. It wasn't a revolution. Most men still built quick standard cabins because they were broke or desperate or unconvinced. But the men who'd spent a winter suffering in a standard cabin and then spent time in a well-insulated cabin understood the difference. And when they built again, they built better. In 1879, the mining camp that had been scattered cabins and gulches officially became the town of Leadville. A newspaper started publishing. A town council formed. Building practices began to be discussed in terms of community standards. An article in the Leadville Chronicle in November 1879 discussed cabin construction and explicitly mentioned the Blackwood method of double-wall insulated construction. The article noted that cabins built this way used less than half the firewood of standard construction and were notably more comfortable in both summer and winter seasons. By 1880, double-wall construction was becoming standard practice among those who could afford it. New arrivals to Leadville were advised to build with insulation if they planned to stay through winter. The men who'd laughed at Samuel's massive foundation and his months of work now pointed to his cabin as an example of proper mountain construction. Samuel himself had become something of a reluctant expert. Men sought his advice. He'd walk a cabin site with someone and suggest where to position the structure for best solar gain, how to orient it to minimize wind exposure, how to think about drainage and moisture control. He didn't charge for advice. He figured the knowledge should spread, but people often paid him anyway, in firewood or labor or fresh-killed meat. One conversation from the spring of 1880 captured the change in attitude. A young man named William Porter, newly arrived from Illinois, was planning his cabin. He sought Samuel out. "I heard you're the man to talk to about building," William said. "I've built a few," Samuel said. "I can spend 3 weeks and build quick, or I can spend longer and build right. Everyone tells me to build right if I'm staying, but I need to understand what right means up here." Samuel appreciated the question. The young man wasn't asking for a blueprint. He was asking for principles. "Right means thinking about the cold," Samuel said. "3 things matter: keeping heat in, storing heat, and making heat efficiently. Keep heat in with insulation double walls, with dead airspace and fill material. Store heat with thermal mass stone walls, stone floors, anything heavy that can absorb warmth during the day and release it at night. Make heat efficiently with a good stove and a tight cabin that doesn't leak air. How much does it cost to build that way? Time, mostly. Maybe 2 months instead of 3 weeks. Materials, maybe $50 instead of $5. But I save on firewood? You save more than you spend. First winter pays for half the extra cost. Second winter puts you ahead." William nodded. "Then I'll build right. I'm not going through what I've heard men went through in that cold snap 2 winters back." "Smart choice," Samuel said. This conversation repeated itself dozens of times in those years. Men learned. The community's standards shifted. What had seemed excessive in 1876 was common sense by 1880. Samuel married in the spring of 1878. Her name was Margaret Bowen, a widow from Iowa who'd come to Leadville with her brother and his family. She'd been married before, had lost her husband to pneumonia, had no children. She was 34 years old, practical and capable, and when Samuel began courting her in the late winter of 1878, she made it clear that she appreciated a man who built well. "Your cabin is warmer than most houses I've lived in," she told him on her first visit. That says something about a man's judgment. They were married on April 22, 1878, in a simple ceremony at the small church that had just been completed in Leadville. Margaret moved into the cabin, and Samuel made some modifications to accommodate two people. He extended the cabin by 4 feet, adding space for a larger sleeping area. He built more shelves, a proper table, a second window on the east wall to let in morning light. They had their first child in 1879, a daughter they named Sarah. A son, Robert, came in 1881. Another daughter, Catherine, in 1883. The cabin that Samuel had built for one man now housed a family of 5, and it served them well. The children grew up knowing warmth in winter and comfort in summer. They didn't know, until they were older, that other children in other cabins had shivered through winters and baked through summers. To Sarah, Robert, and Catherine, the thick walls and the stone thermal mass and a well-designed stove were simply how houses were. Normal. Samuel continued mining through the 1880s, but his claim never made him rich. He earned enough to support his family, to pay for supplies, to buy lumber when he needed it and livestock when he could afford it. In 1885, he took a job as a carpenter in Leadville, building houses and commercial buildings. The town was booming, and men who understood construction were in demand. He built houses for others the same way he'd built his own cabin. Double walls, insulation, thermal mass. Tight construction. Some clients balked at the cost, wanted him to build cheaper. Samuel would explain the principles, show them the mathematics of firewood savings, and let them decide. About half chose to build right. The other half built standard and regretted it later. By 1890, Samuel was known in Leadville as the best builder around for mountain construction. He'd built perhaps 30 houses, each one incorporating the lessons he'd learned in his own cabin. He'd taught a dozen younger carpenters who worked for him, passing on the techniques and principles. The knowledge was spreading through a network of builders who understood that in this climate, at this altitude, standard construction wasn't good enough. The cabin itself aged well. By 1890, it had stood for 14 years. The logs had settled and dried. The chinking had been renewed once. The roof had been patched in a few spots where particularly heavy snow loads had damaged shakes. But the structure was fundamentally sound. The double walls showed no signs of moisture damage. Samuel's ventilation system had worked as designed, preventing the condensation problems that plagued some heavily insulated structures. In 1895, with his children mostly grown, Sarah was 16, Robert 14, Catherine 12, Samuel and Margaret discussed whether to build a larger house in town. Leadville had matured into a proper city. There were schools, churches, paved streets, a hospital. Living in town would be more convenient, especially as Samuel's carpentry business had grown to the point where he supervised multiple work crews. But Margaret had become attached to the cabin in California Gulch. It was home. It was where her children had been born. It was comfortable in ways that went beyond simple thermal performance. "We'll stay," she told Samuel. "When the children are grown and gone, maybe then we'll think about town. But for now, this is where we belong." They stayed. Samuel continued building houses in Leadville through the 1890s and into the early 1900s. He taught his son, Robert, the carpentry trade, and by 1900, Robert was building houses of his own, using the same principles Samuel had pioneered. In 1907, at the age of 74, Samuel retired from active building. He'd been a carpenter and builder for more than 40 years, had built hundreds of structures, had taught dozens of men the trade. His hands were gnarled with arthritis. His back was stiff, but he'd done well. He'd provided for his family, had made a mark on the community, had left the built environment better than he'd found it. Margaret died in 1909 at the age of 65 from a stroke. Samuel continued living in the cabin for another 6 years, cared for by his daughter Catherine, who'd married a miner and lived nearby. He spent his final years sitting in the sun-warmed alcove between the south-facing windows, the same spot he'd designed 33 years earlier to capture solar heat in winter. Samuel Blackwood died on November 3, 1915, at the age of 82. He died in his sleep in the cabin he'd built, with his children nearby. The cause was simply old age. His heart stopped, and that was that. The cabin stood until 1932. Robert inherited it and considered tearing it down to salvage the materials, but sentiment prevented him. Instead, he used it as a storage shed for mining equipment. By the 1920s, Leadville's boom had faded. The richest silver deposits were exhausted. The population had declined. Many of the cabins and houses from the early years had been abandoned or torn down. But Samuel's cabin remained. The double walls and thick roof made it weatherproof even without maintenance. The foundation didn't heave or shift. The logs didn't rot. It simply sat there, solid and functional, through decades of weather. In 1932, a particularly harsh winter storm collapsed part of the roof. Robert finally tore down what remained, salvaging the iron stove and some of the better timbers. The stone foundation was left in place, too much work to remove, and it wasn't hurting anything. The foundation stones are still there today, visible to anyone who hikes up into California Gulch and knows where to look. Moss has grown over them. Aspen trees have sprouted in what was once the interior of the cabin. But the stones remain, a testament to the care with which Samuel built. The knowledge Samuel pioneered persisted long after the cabin itself was gone. His son Robert built houses using his father's methods through the 1930s. Robert's apprentices carried the techniques into the 1940s and beyond. The specific methods evolved, new materials became available, new technologies emerged, but the core principles remained. By the mid-20th century, when serious academic study of building science began, the principles Samuel had worked out through practical experience were being formalized with scientific rigor. Thermal mass, R values, air infiltration, heat storage, vapor barriers. The vocabulary changed, but the physics didn't. Houses in mountain environments today are built with heavy insulation, thermal breaks, air sealing, and passive solar design. They're built with the understanding that in extreme climates, standard construction isn't adequate. They're built using principles that Samuel Blackwood figured out in 1876, watching how heat moved through materials and thinking about how to control it. The innovation Samuel Blackwood brought to cabin construction wasn't any single technique. Double wall construction had been used elsewhere. Insulation had been used elsewhere. Thermal mass had been used elsewhere. What Samuel did was combine these principles into a systematic approach, specifically adapted to high altitude mountain conditions where summer heat and winter cold were both extreme. The underlying principle was simple: thermal control. Heat moves in predictable ways, by conduction through materials, by convection through air, by radiation from warm surfaces to cold ones. A cabin in the mountains experiences thermal assault from both directions: brutal cold trying to get in during winter, brutal heat trying to get in during summer. Standard cabin construction didn't control these heat flows, it merely slowed them slightly. A single layer of 12-inch logs provided some insulation, but not enough. Gaps between logs allowed air infiltration, which meant heat could escape or enter through convection, even when conduction was minimized. A thin roof meant heat loss upward in winter, and heat gain downward in summer. A leaky door meant constant air exchange with the outside. Samuel's approach was to control every pathway for heat movement. Thick insulation in walls and roof slowed conduction. Tight construction prevented air infiltration. Thermal mass provided a heat battery, a way to store warmth when it was available and release it when it was needed. Controlled ventilation allowed fresh air exchange without surrendering thermal control. The result was a cabin that required less than half the heating fuel of standard construction and remained comfortable in summer without any cooling at all. The mathematics were straightforward. Standard cabin burned 4 cords per month. Samuel's cabin burned 1.5 cords per month. Over a 6-month winter, that was 15 cords saved. At 2 weeks of labor per cord, that was 30 weeks of labor saved. The 12 extra weeks Samuel spent building were repaid in less than 1 winter. But the impact went beyond simple economics. Comfort matters. Health matters. A warm, dry cabin meant better sleep, better health, less stress on the body. Children raised in comfortable houses were healthier than children raised in cold, damp ones. Families in comfortable houses were happier than families constantly fighting against inadequate shelter. The social impact rippled outward. Samuel had been mocked for his excessive building, but once his approach proved successful, it changed community standards. Men who might have built inadequate cabins because that's how it's done, instead built better because they'd seen evidence that better was possible. Knowledge spread through example and through teaching. Building practices improved across the entire community. The economic impact was substantial. Less firewood burned meant less time spent cutting firewood, which meant more time available for productive work. It meant less forest destroyed for fuel. It meant money saved that could go to other necessities. On a community scale, improved building practices meant greater economic productivity and sustainability. The environmental impact, though not discussed in those terms at the time, was real. Cutting 4 cords per month per cabin, with 200 cabins in the area, meant 1,600 cords per month, roughly 16,000 trees destroyed every winter. Cutting 2 cords per cabin reduced that by half. The forest recovered faster, fuel supplies remained adequate longer, and the visual scarring of the landscape was reduced. The knowledge-sharing tradition that Samuel established freely, giving advice, teaching principles rather than just techniques, encouraging adaptation rather than rote copying meant that the knowledge evolved and improved. James Wheeler's edition of the Root Cellar was an innovation on the innovation. Others added their own improvements, adapted the techniques to different materials and situations, and passed on what they learned. The broader lessons extend beyond cabin construction. Samuel's story illustrates several timeless principles. First, conventional wisdom isn't always wise. Standard practice becomes standard because it's easy, familiar, and cheap, not necessarily because it's best. Sometimes the conventional approach is simply what people do, because it's what people have always done, and questioning it invites mockery. Second, initial cost and total cost are different. The standard cabin was cheaper and faster to build, but far more expensive to operate. Looking only at upfront investment without considering on-costs leads to poor decisions. Samuel's cabin cost more initially, but saved money and misery over its lifetime. Third, mockery and social pressure are often the costs of being right before others recognize it. Samuel endured months of skepticism and criticism. His vindication came only after the crisis proved his approach superior. But if he'd caved to social pressure and built standard, he would have suffered like everyone else. Fourth, expertise and experience matter. Samuel knew things that other settlers didn't because he'd lived in harsher climates, had worked with different building traditions, had thought deeply about materials and thermal physics. His unusual background gave him unusual insights. Listening to experts, even when they're doing something strange, can save you from painful learning experiences. Fifth, worst case planning beats average case planning. Standard cabins were built for average winters and tolerable summers. They failed catastrophically when conditions turned extreme. Samuel built for the worst conditions he could imagine, and when those conditions arrived, his preparation paid off. Sixth, helping others doesn't diminish your advantage. Samuel could have kept his knowledge secret, could have charged consulting fees, could have profited from others' suffering. Instead, he freely shared what he knew. The result was a better community, stronger relationships, and a legacy that outlasted his lifetime. His reputation as a builder and his business success came from his generosity, not despite it. Finally, good design is invisible until it's tested. Samuel's cabin looked excessive until the 40 below cold proved it necessary. The massive foundation seemed wasteful until years of use showed its durability. The expensive windows seemed frivolous until the solar gain they provided reduced fuel consumption. Good design often appears excessive until conditions test the design and reveal the wisdom that went into it. Samuel Blackwood died in 1915, having lived 82 years. He'd been a furniture maker's son, a timber worker, a soldier, a farmer, a carpenter, a miner, a builder, a husband, a father, and a teacher. His cabin stood for 56 years. His building techniques influenced construction practices for decades. His children and grandchildren lived in homes built using principles he'd pioneered. But perhaps his most important legacy was simpler than any of that. He proved that thinking carefully about problems, drawing on deep experience, accepting short-term costs for long-term benefits, and sharing knowledge freely were approaches that served both individual and community well. He proved that in extreme environments, adequate isn't adequate, only excellent is sufficient. And he proved that being different, being patient, and being right were worth the mockery and doubt that came with them. The stones of his foundation still sit in California Gulch, slowly being reclaimed by forest. But the principles he worked out while building on those stones remain relevant anywhere people build shelter, anywhere people face extreme conditions, anywhere the conventional approach isn't working as well as it should. Heat still moves in predictable ways. Insulation still slows its movement. Thermal mass still stores it. Tight construction still prevents air infiltration. These principles are eternal because they're based on physics, not fashion. And the lesson Samuel's life teaches is equally eternal. When everyone is doing something one way and suffering as a result, there's value in thinking differently, building better, and accepting the short-term cost of excellence over the long-term price of adequacy. That's a lesson that applies to building cabins, certainly, but it applies to everything else as well. For more interesting stories, check this out.